Hi, today we are discussing the two types of assessments, namely the formative and summative assessment. Now, the formative focuses on how the students are learning and achieving the learning outcomes, while summative focuses on how much the students have learned in the certain topic unit or course. This means that formative happens throughout the process, while summative happens at the end of the learning process. Now, formative is compared to when the chef tastes the food in the kitchen before it reaches the customers for eating and feedback, meaning that they still have a chance to improve the food if it does not meet the standards before it can be served to the customer. Summative, on the other hand, is compared to a customer tasting food. There is no going back because the customer has already passed their judgment on whether the food is tasty or not. So likewise, in formative assessment, students are given a chance to test the knowledge, not as final assessments, but for improvement purposes, while in summative, students submit their assessment for grading to determine whether a student passed, failed, or qualifies for the next level, as the main focus is the end product. Now, the significance of formative assessment is that it allows for feedback, which helps lecturers and students identify where there is slack so that they can improve. They also provide lecturers with opportunities to regularly monitor students' learning and offer feedback, both positive and constructive. The significance of summative, on the other hand, is that it measures students' learning and decides whether the person understands the content and whether they qualify for the next level of their studies or whether they fail and therefore deserve to repeat. In summary, formative assessment evaluates learning while it's happening, while summative assessment typically take place at the end of term or learning unit. Formative assessment typically have lower stakes and may not be graded, while summative assessment typically have higher stakes and are usually graded. Types of formative assessments. There are different types of formative assessments, but we will only discuss three, which is the quizzes, the peer assessment, and then the classroom discussion. Now, the quizzes are given to test the students' understanding as the studies progress, usually at the end of each topic or lesson. As a labor law lecturer, I will either do a multiple choice quiz or a word matching quiz for the students to understand their level of understanding of the discussed topic or lesson. Example, as a labor lecturer, after discussing the topic on leave, I would give the students the following task to match the sentences in A with the correct sentence in B as follows. Now, if the student does not perform well, it will then help me determine whether a revision test is required, if a class must be organized to allow students to seek clarity and further explain why students went wrong and how they can be assisted. Peer assessment. In peer assessment, a student is given a chance to improve before final submission for grading. In this case, I will give an assessment which is supposed to be summative. However, a date before due date will be set to review the student's assessment and give the student feedback in form of comments, allowing the student to improve their assessment before deadline and resubmit for grading. Example, the assignment is due on the 20th of May. However, a student may submit it by the 10th so that I can provide the student with feedback to improve their assignment. Then we have the classroom discussion. This is an open discussion which happens where a topic is discussed either face-to-face in class or on the online platform discussion forum. I'll then ask students to contribute to a specific topic in their own words to evaluate their understanding of the topic. Depending on the level of understanding, I'll then act accordingly to improve the student's understanding. An example may be, in the discussion forum, discuss the different types of leave and how they can assist you in your job as a human resource manager. Types of summative assessment. There are different types of summative assessment, but for this video, we will only discuss the exams, the projects, and the portfolio as some of the types of summative assessment. So with exams, at the end of the semester, I will then ask questions on the curriculum, and the labor law students will write an exam to test the knowledge that they have acquired during the semester and evaluate whether the knowledge is sufficient for a pass or fail. It is at this stage then I will then also use that exam to ascertain whether the student has actually achieved the objectives in terms of the curriculum. Number 2, you have the project. Now, this I will do in groups where the students are requested to identify an organization, for example, of their choice and draft a policy on employee leave and present it to class. The students and lecturer are then allowed to ask questions during this presentation, and marks are allocated to the students' main project to test their ability to apply the knowledge as stated in the objectives at the beginning. And then a presentation is then also marked or graded differently to test the ability of that student to communicate and defend the knowledge that they have learned as part of the learning objectives. Then we have the portfolio. Now, the portfolio, I will apply that as a labor law lecturer. The students must collect and present all the work to show effort for what they have done throughout the course to make a decision on whether they have passed or not. Now, this may include practical exercises that they have done, observations. This may also include the documents that they have drafted throughout, the quizzes that they have done, the tests and the assignments that they might have written. So together and collectively, all this is brought together for me as a student to be able to determine whether these students are able to pass and move on to the next level. This I will then do by adding all their effort and getting an average percentage to determine a pass or a fail. Now, the rationale. The rationale of the formative and summative will be discussed as follows. Focusing on the course objectives, focusing on the content, and also focusing on the student characteristic. Now, by focusing on the objectives, the formative's rationale when it comes to the objective of the curriculum is to ensure that the student will be able to achieve the objectives of the course, and where it is detected that there is a possibility of not achieving such objectives, improvement is then done, or rather action is then taken to ensure that the objectives of the course are met. Summative rationale when it comes to objective of the course. It's to test whether the set course objectives were met by the student, or whether the lecturer can, at the end of the course, then certify that the student has actually met the objectives of the course. So that is the rationale of summative in as far as objectives are concerned. Now, when it comes to content, the rationale for formative is whether there is a need to improve the content to ensure that course objectives are met. So at the end of the formative assessment, the rationale is that is there a need to improve the content so that the objectives are met based on the feedback that's obtained from the formative assessment. Now, with summative, it's to determine whether the content was understood and grasped enough to answer the questions. So with summative, when one tests for summative, they will then be able to know whether the content was understood and whether it was grasped enough to answer the questions. Now, when it comes to student characteristics or student characters, the formative, the rationale is whether the student is able to grasp the knowledge or the assessment need to be adjusted. Example, if they are slow learners. So an adaptive approach is then applied in terms of formative when it comes to the characteristic of the student. So once an assessment is done, an adaptive approach is then done. Is this perhaps a slow learner that one actually need to adjust the assessment to cater for the characteristic of the student, for example, slow learners? Now, with the summative, mostly designed for fast learners who can catch up without requiring revision or further explanations. So when it comes to summative, the rationale is that students are able to grasp at the same level as those ones who are slow. So there's no consideration of who is slow or who is fast, but the rationale is just done as if all the students are fast learners. Best practice for effectively implementing the formative assessment. To effectively implement formative assessment, literature suggests the following practices. To individualize instruction based on the assessment feedback. In many instances, this will require a paradigm shift in the minds and practices of lecturers away from their approach of assessment being summative for giving grades to formative for adjusting instructions based on assessment feedback. The high institution culture must embrace formative assessment as standard operating procedure in all classrooms. This means that the building's administrative team consistently emphasizes the importance of formative assessment and its members behave in a manner that's supported. For example, the librarians are in support when students are doing their formative assessments. Inclusion of crucial elements of formative assessment, making it part of the institution's formal lecturer evaluation system. An institution-wide operational definition of formative assessment is needed, with accompanying examples, including examples specific to each academic department's content. For example, the faculty of law, the faculty of education. So there should be examples that speak to each academic department's content in terms of what is expected when it comes to formative assessment. Both faculties and students, and they need to be involved in identifying the types of formative assessment that are most useful based on the content of specific courses. This is to maximize learning because now students need to understand their accountability role in formative assessment. And when they are involved, they understand their accountability role in that aspect. Further, ongoing feedback must be solicited from students to obtain insight regarding what methodologies for individualizing instruction work best for them and why. A comprehensive staff development program focusing on formative assessment and how to individualize instruction is essential. Part of this staff development program must be personalized to the needs of each lecturer. In addition, the staff development program should furnish specific examples of state-of-the-art use of formative assessment on a department-by-department basis. Galaika and Batman in 2017 indicated that the adaptive approach in formative is an effective practice and suggested 5 phases that should be practiced in formative approach to ensure effectiveness. They then presented same in form of a diagram, indicating that phase 1 is clarifying expectation. The students must be clear as to the lecturer's expectation in terms of their assessment. Phase 2, eliciting and collecting student reaction. How did the children do? How did the children behave towards this assessment? How did the student score? What did they get right and what did they get wrong? Phase 3, analyzing and interpreting their reaction. If the students didn't score well, what is the interpretation? What conclusion can then be drawn from there? And that's phase 3. Phase 4, communicating with the students about the results, meaning that you do not just assume in interpreting in phase 3, but what you do is, as a lecturer, they also have to reach out to the students and find out why the results were the way they were, or why there was a specific or certain type of reaction to the assessment. Then phase number 5 is taking follow-up action, meaning that the information that is obtained through communication, as well as the interpretation of the reaction of the students towards the assessment, is not left there, but its action is actually taken, follow-ups are done, action to ensure adaptive education and learning, meaning that the individual students are then considered on how best things can be changed to actually improve. Best practice for effectively implementing the summative assessment. Literature suggests best practices to ensure effective implementation of the summative assessment approach. Now, a study conducted at the Medical School of the University of Zambia by Dhaka in 2021 recommends the following practices: that there is a need for timely feedback to be given to students, and also feedback that should be detailed. It further suggests that there is a need to organize specific pedagogical training programs for both existing and newly employed academic staff. Now, other best practices include those that have been provided by Thyssen in their article in 2019, which is the use of backward design that starts by defining the learning outcomes and what type of assessments are most suitable to measure the outcomes. The document a testing blueprint that shows that domains will be tested and how this matches the learning outcomes. Then share the blueprint with all stakeholders. It also includes engaging as much as possible with faculty peer review during the test development process to avoid introducing construct underrepresentation and construct irrelevant variance. Include enough items and items of high quality to assure adequate test reliability and defensibility of scores. Apply standard testing methods. Provide students with clear instructions and practice materials, and develop a plan to ensure the integrity of data throughout the testing process. Then, monitor the fairness, acceptability, and impact of testing over time with routines, surveying, of stakeholders and comparison of test scores with other measures of students' outcomes. Now, this is sometimes also what we refer to as moderation, or an example of this kind of monitoring would also include moderating. In conclusion, the summative and formative approach in higher education are both very crucial. The one allows for students to be tested and feedback to be collected for purposes of improvement. And the other allows for students to be tested to understand or be evaluated to understand whether they have grasped the content of the course or they have met the learning objectives of the course. Now, they are both important because it is necessary for lecturers to give formative assessments in order for the students to be given a chance to test themselves and be able to improve. It's also very important for lecturers to give summative assessments because it will help them understand whether the student has met the requirements in terms of the course objectives and whether they qualify to either graduate, move on to the next step of their academic journey, or whether they are indeed qualified to be awarded. That having been said, thank you for listening.